What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. So, in this video, I love doing these types of videos. I love debunking a lot of the stupidity that we see out there, and there's a lot of Wilt hate that goes on out there. Now, let me say this before I go further. If you think that the fact that Wilt won 2 championships is a detriment to his career, and that's something that hurts his legacy, that's fair criticism. That's fair criticism. I could make excuses, but for him. But at the end of the day, that's fair criticism. If you think that the fact that he was a poor free throw shooter is a dent in his legacy, that's very fair criticism. Like Shaq, like other big men who had trouble making foul shots, a lot of it was psychological because, I hear rumors that Shaq in practice be making 75% of his free throws, but, in the games, he just was terrible. 52% for his career. Wilt, 51%. And Wilt got worse as he got older, which possibly indicates 2 things: that as he got stronger, it was getting harder for him to make free throws, and there was a psychological component behind it. That's a fair assessment. If you think that maybe sometimes in some games, because Wilt feared being perceived as a bully, sometimes he let up a little bit on his aggression because he didn't like being seen as the big brute. That's a fair criticism. These are things that are fair criticisms. I'm not some Wilt Chamberlain fanboy that thinks that he did no wrong. But when people go out there and lie and say things that are not true, that's what draw my ire. That's what draw the ire of a lot of people who know the history of basketball and hear people say stupid shit. When you say Wilt Chamberlain played against 6'4" white midgets, you sound like try not to curse too much. You sound like a freaking idiot. Okay? What that shows is that you have no knowledge of the time period whatsoever when he played. For instance, you're probably thinking about pictures of, say, before the NBA, when there was regional pro groups or semi-pro groups, and you saw maybe a picture of it might be 5 starters, and names might be Abe Happerstein, Rube Waddell, or some shit like that. And they had these unathletic bodies because, there was no weightlifting. So a lot of these guys were not athletes as far as today. And the center was 6'4". And that was because there was a strong belief before the 1940s that being tall actually was a detriment to basketball, because they felt like if you were closer to 7 feet tall, you'd be clumsy and uncoordinated. Yes, they actually believed it at one point in time. The guy that broke that mold was George Mikan. But anyway, when Wilt Chamberlain played, the average center was 6'10". Guess what the average center today is? 6'10". Another thing that bothers me when people say, well, Wilt played against a bunch of plumbers and taxi drivers and firemen. Well, not only does that statement smack up snobism and elitism, what the hell is wrong with being a taxi driver? What's wrong with being a fireman? Because if I'm not mistaken, firemen did a good goddamn job on 9/11. You know what I'm saying? Those men, as time has proven, traded their lives because these guys were going to die of 9/11 related lung diseases. They risked their lives ultimately to try to save others. So what's wrong with being a fireman? But anyway, regardless of that point, no, by the 1960s, the best players in the NBA were making $150,000 a year, which is the equivalency of making about $1 million per season now. Now, of course, that's not making 40 or 50 million, but they were making the equivalency of what, at least what most CEOs were making at that time before we started having this big gap between the rich and the poor. They weren't living poorly. They were able to live in the most prestigious neighborhoods at that time. The only players in the mid 1960s that may have had some part-time jobs are the ass splinter guys, the guys that were the 11th and 12th men on the rosters. You might be thinking about the late 40s, early 50s, maybe into the mid 50s, when these players were making $5,000, $8,000, $12,000, $25,000 a year, and with the exception of maybe one or two superstars, yeah, they had to, because they weren't making a lot of money and the league was just starting off, yeah, they had to get part-time jobs in the off-season. But it had nothing to do with the fact that they were bums. They just didn't make a lot of fucking money. I don't understand why people can't comprehend that. That's like, remember the guy that was on the Cosby Show? I can't think of his name. I think he's the one that was married to Sandra on the show. Remember it was found out that he was working at like Home Depot a couple years ago? Does that mean that he still wasn't a great actor? Or does it mean that he just hadn't had any roles? Maybe he just hadn't had any offers. He still, the gift was still there. His ability to act was still there. He just hadn't had any roles. So these players, they were great players, but they weren't, they just didn't have the access year round to fundings or funds, or going to be able to go overseas and make money. So they had to do what they had to do to survive. So that always gets under my skin. And then what other criticisms are there of Wilt that's stupid? He didn't have any quality competition. That's the stupidest I've ever heard. Wilt Chamberlain, look, first of all, let me throw it back at you. Who the hell did Shaq play in the finals? Who did Shaq play in the finals that's Hall of Fame worthy? Rick Smits, 2000, who was playing his last games of his career, was not the Rick Smits from 5 years earlier or 6 years earlier. His feet problems had really caused him to slow down. That's who was guarding him. Now, Rick Smits is not a Hall of Famer. He was really good. In his prime, he'll get you 18 points, 18, maybe 19 points, 6.5 rebounds. Was never a strong rebounder despite being 7'4", but he wasn't a Hall of Famer. Then in 2001, he did go up against a Hall of Famer, Dikembe Mutombo, but Mutombo was right at the edge of the downcline of his career, the decline of his career. And at that point, Shaq was 370. But Dikembe Mutombo was like 260. He could not handle Shaq because the league was allowing Shaq to use that elbow to bully people and offensive foul a motherfucker. And you can't do anything if Shaq gets that down. If he gets that type of positioning down low, and he gets to use his forearm to knock you in your motherfucking mouth and dunk over you. What can you do? And then the last finals that he was in three-peat, he went up against the great Todd McCullough. Can anybody even recognize Todd McCullough if you saw a picture of him? And it's funny, the one finals he played in, where he played against a great player in his prime, which was the 2004 finals when he went up against Big Ben Wallace, they lost in 5. It wasn't for Kobe hitting that game-time shot at the buzzer, guess what would have happened? They would have got swept again, which, by the way, Shaq got swept 6 times in his career. That would have been the 7th time. Wilt supposed to be this perennial choker, but I think Wilt only got swept in the playoffs twice. Shaq 6 times. And then in the other finals, who were they going up against? Eric Dampier with the Mavericks? So what were all these great centers that he was going up against? I also want to ask another question. Name another center who won a championship, won a league MVP, had there been a finals MVP, would have won that in 1967, led the league in field goal percentage, led the league in rebounding, and would have led the league in blocks if that was an official stat that they tracked. Can you give me one other player other than Wilt and Norman Chamberlain who would have achieved that? No, you can't. Even when Elijah won his 2 championships back-to-back, he did not lead the league in scoring. Don't get me wrong, he had some dominant campaigns, but he didn't lead the league in scoring. He didn't lead the league in rebounding any of those years. He didn't lead the league in block shots any of those years. Shaq never led the league in blocks or rebounding. Nobody's else ever done that. And for those of you who say, hey, why did Wilt only average 22.5 points per game during the playoffs, but 30.1 points per game during the regular season? That's the ultimate sign he was a choke artist. He couldn't get done in the playoffs. Well, what you have to remember is Wilt played in, I believe, 160 playoff games. 160. And if I'm not mistaken, I think 80 or 88, one of those two totals, over half or over half of all of his playoff games came when he played with the Lakers. Because he was finally on a really good team. Not to mention the fact that the playoff format had expanded. There was more rounds, which means more games, which means that when he was basically playing Bill Russell's role, which is more of a rebounder and defender and not a scorer, guess what? That means he was having more games, scoring 18, 14, 13, because that was his role in the offense. It was bringing down his career playoff scoring average. As opposed to, say, when he was playing with the the Warriors, he was averaging 34 points a game in the playoffs, which means that if he had continued being a primary scorer, which he was starting in the 1969-70 season, the coach wanted him to be a scorer, and he was doing that, averaging over 32 points a game before he suffered that leg injury, which ended his season. But anyway, actually took him out for about 4 months and he came back. But anyway, what if he kept playing like that, like he did with the Warriors, just being a scorer, never changing his game? Well, he would probably be the regular season all-time leading scorer in average and playoffs. And there's some other things I like to bring up that people don't want to think about. The rules prevented Wilt Chamberlain from going pro a year earlier. There was, Wilt Chamberlain left college 1 year early, Kansas. But there was rules set up that prevented players from going pro within a 4-year span of when they went to college. So that's why Wilt Chamberlain played 1 year with the Harlem Globetrotters, because he was prevented from playing in the NBA during the 58-59 season. But if that rule didn't exist and he went pro that year, and let's just give him a 35 point per game scoring average instead of 37.6. Give him 35. And as Will has said before, when I was playing, I wasn't concerned about all-time numbers. I didn't realize that these things would matter so much until years later, starting in the 80s. Just like with Oscar Robertson. The triple-double didn't really become a thing until Magic. Oscar Robertson would get triple-doubles all the time, but it wasn't really celebrated like that. It wasn't really a thing until Magic Johnson started doing it. So what if these guys thought like the players of today and said, you know what? I'm going to come out here and try to get triple doubles. I'm going to come out here and try to score 40 and 50, even more. I mean, think about this. If you think Wilt Chamberlain didn't change his game, Wilt had 122 career 50-point games, including the playoffs. Well, almost 100 of those games came in Wilt's first 5 seasons, which means that the last 9 years that he played, he only had 20-something 50-point games, which means that he was changing his game to being more of a team-orientated player. Because as I've said before, when he was playing with the Warriors, the head coach, Frank McGuire, wanted him to be this ridiculous scoring machine. But Wilt changed and altered his game when he started having help. When he finally got help, that's when he was able to go down from taking 40 shots a game, down from taking 28, 30 shots a game, to 10, 11, 14 shots per game. Look at his shot attempts. Just to prove my point to you guys. People like to say Wilt was his ball hog, right? Let me go to 1966-67 and go onward until the end of his career. 1966-67, right? Wilt averaged 14.2 shot attempts per game. 66-67. 67-68. Wilt averaged, that year he averaged 16.8 shot attempts per game. 68-69. Now I think that's the first years with the Lakers. Let me switch to the Lakers. All right, his first year with the Lakers, 13.6 shot attempts per game. Now, 69-70, that was the year that they initially wanted him to be a primary scorer, but then they changed it. I think they changed it as when he came back, so his shot attempts may be a little higher that year. Yeah, 18.9 shot attempts per game. Earlier it was in the 20s, but starting in 70-71, I think it was, that's when his shot attempts started going down again. 15 shot attempts. 15. 71-72. 9.3 shot attempts per game. 9. In his last year in the NBA, 72-73. Wilt was taking 7.1 shot attempts per game, but was still averaging 13. Now you tell me, how is he supposed to average 33 points a game in the playoffs when he's only taken the last few years 7 shot attempts? I don't know what the playoffs, but probably roughly the same. 7.1, 9 shots, 15 shots, 14 shots, but he still wound up averaging 30.1 points per game for his career. So if Wilt really wanted to focus on stats, he could have been a difficult player. He could have refused to alter his game for the betterment of the team, and he could have put a lot of these records way out of the way. He could have put them way out of the way. He could have played longer. He would have played longer. He would have played until he was 40 years old. And, he would have finished with 40-something thousand points. 40-something thousand points, probably 30,000-something rebounds. And his numbers would look even more ridiculous. But anyway, that's all I got to say about that. Tell me what you guys think.